some fundamentals that will be completely obvious to you, but need to be said because I think sometimes they're misconstrued in terms of racing driver schools, where to brake, where to turn in, where the apex is. So let's just have a look at these very quick fundamentals. The first point of which is the fastest way to travel is in a straight line. A car develops maximum grip when the front tires are straight and when all four tires are as square to the road as the chosen suspension geometry, cambers, toe-in, Ackerman, etc., will allow. Now, that may seem very obvious, but it's a very important point to bear in mind when analysing a driver like Max, because what he does, whether he does it consciously or subconsciously is irrelevant. What he does is acknowledge that the car is at its best when it's travelling in a straight line with very little friction or G-loading going through the car. And this is what Alan Jones said. When Alan Jones started to win Grand Prix, and apparently from nowhere, even though those who've been watching him from the early Formula 3 and Formula Atlantic days knew how good he was, but when he started to win races with Williams, he often said in interviews, well, I learned from my dad, Stan, who was a very, very good driver, Australian Grand Prix winner. I learned from my father, Stan, that the quickest way for a car to travel is in a straight line. So I always try to keep the car as straight as possible. Of course, that wasn't always the case with Alan Jones because he was really good at loading up the rear and nice oversteer slides, particularly in the Williams FW07. But nonetheless, you see where he was coming from. So that's the first point. The second point is that these straights, the ultra important parts of the lap, have two ends. And the shorter the ends, the longer the straight. Now think about that. May seem incredibly obvious, but in reality, you know what's coming next. It's the corners, of course, that separate the straights. And the shorter you can make the corners, the longer you can make the straights. And the third point is really just a conclusion from all of the above, which is that there is as much time to be found between the corners as in them. In other words, it's the straights that the great drivers are thinking about when they approach a corner, not necessarily the corner. And I make that point because particularly now with the advent of so much telemetry and graphics on screen, there's so much emphasis on high minimum speeds, on braking points, on who's braking latest into any given corner, who's perhaps getting on the power soonest, what car is performing most effectively on which type of corner. It's all there, all the graphics are there. But in reality, in my opinion, those graphics tend to confuse the real situation. So at this point, let's put things into perspective a little and bring up a quote from Jim Clark from about 1964. And it is the following. I know I'm inclined to go into a corner earlier than most people. I prefer to cut into the corner early to make a false apex and to set the car up for the next bit of straight. Now, if that doesn't sort of ring true from the fundamentals we've just been talking about, I don't know what does. And that's just to show you that as long ago as 1964, drivers like Jim Clark were starting to feel that they were different from their peers. I spoke to Sterling Moss about this once, and he said exactly the same thing, that he always felt slightly different because of how he approached the corner. And he used to go on about the stability, the importance of stability, the platform going into the corner. But he also made the point that he would actually, like Jim Clark, go in for an earlier apex than most. And now let's have a look at another driver, Mark Donoghue, a great engineer driver. Formula One record, sadly, far too short, lost his life in Austria in 75. But a fabulous driver when it came to analysing what the dynamics of driving were all about. And here's a very simple quote from Mark. The fastest way into a corner is gradually to trade off braking traction versus cornering traction. In other words, don't brake in a straight line as late as possible and then turn in the car loaded up with lateral G. You've got to make the transition gradual. I use the word seamless describing relatively recently Alexander Albon's turn in. Really, really good. He does that gradual switch from braking load to lateral load incredibly well. A few other things, a few other shortcomings perhaps he still has, but that was an early sign, and that was in the early Red Bull days that we could see that from some very nice images they showed us of Alex going into Copse, the transition there, beautifully seamless. Jarno Trulli was another, really seamless transitions. Most of the great drivers too, you've got to say. And Mark was saying that in the context of the friction circle, really simple way of understanding the difference between braking and acceleration and cornering. So you draw a circle, and at the top you have acceleration, at the bottom you have braking, and either side you've got lateral load, left or right-handers. And a driver who doesn't trade-off braking against acceleration will almost come down to the center point of the axis before then going out to generate lateral load. And as Mark Donoghue said, that is not the quickest way to drive. You maximize the performance of the tire by keeping the little red dot, whatever it is, as near as possible to the outside of the circle. So that puts short corners into context, because short corners are all about exactly that, trading off braking against increasing lateral load. But the real point about short corners is not a gradual trade-off. It's the moment that a great driver like Max would choose to do that trade-off. And what he does is brake to, well, let's call it a transition zone, where he does everything, where he rotates the car, whatever he needs to do, the substance of the corner, if you like, and then creates an angle at that moment, still within the rotation zone, that he needs the car to follow in order to have a great diagonal exit from the corner. So in other words, he condenses everything down to that transition zone, getting the car turned and then making sure the car's at exactly the angle he needs in order to have a clean exit. And either side of that, he's extending the previous straight and extending the beginning of the next straight. And that's a really important point. The corner is about the two straights, not just the straight behind him. And that's the same for any driver who's really good at short corner motoring. I think an obvious first question that would need to be asked is why this transition point, this transition zone where they're doing all that, should be in front of what is the classical geometrical apex. And let's just talk about that geometrical apex and how that's achieved. As anybody who's been to racing driver school would know, you basically extend the lines of the two straights and then bisect the angle. And that bisection is the geometrical apex. And that is an apex that typically many racing drivers and many young drivers are taught to clip at racing driver school, and indeed well after racing driver school, long after karting, and they have a feel for the apex. And that apex can best be approached from an arc on the outside of the corner. And it's very easy to draw that arc. You just have a simple smooth arc and you try to make that line as smooth and as short as possible within the scope of being an arc. And that is what many racing drivers, even on the grid today in 2023, prescribe into any given corner. We'll get onto that in a minute when we're looking at the pros and cons of long corners versus short corners. So the first point is that is where a geometrical apex is. So why is the transition zone, let's not call it an apex, Jim Clark called it a false apex, but why is that transition zone typically ahead of the geometrical apex? The answer is that it's to do with not only the entry to the corner, but the exit of the corner, and getting the car rotated at exactly the angle he needs for the exit is just as important. And it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to do that at the geometric apex because too much time will have passed. And it takes time to get the car rotated, to get the car positioned. So he needs to choose a moment of the least possible downside, A, for rotating the car anyway for the corner, and B, for making sure he's got the right exit angle. Another point to make is that although Max naturally extends the straight that he's on before he begins to turning gradually to this early rotation zone, he's not in any way thinking of braking ultra late. Of course, he's going to brake as late as the feel of the car allows him to brake, but his number one priority always is to touch the brakes a fraction in order to get the weight on the front of the car, to get the car stable and all four tires basically square on the road under braking to get maximum braking efficiency. And by this point, he's already got eyed up in his mind the rotation point that he's braking to, bearing in mind that at some point he wants to be coming out of the brake pedal pressure, once he's applied them hard, to come out of the brake pedal pressure to balance the car against steering load. That's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But all those things are going on in a computation as he's effectively, I use this phrase, eyeing up the transition zone. He's been doing it so many times and it's so natural to him that he's not thinking of anything. He's just feeling all I can describe as the surface of the road as he's approaching that. But to repeat the point, he's not focused on braking as late as possible, and he's certainly not looking at the 100-meter board or the 110-meter board or the 90-meter board, knowing that his teammate has braked at 87 meters or 92 meters, trying to brake a little bit later. That is completely irrelevant to Max. What Max is looking at is the rotation point. And that's why I often say, Max is an early braker, because the reality is he's probably just touching the brakes quite early just to get the car settled, to get the front down before he's braking really hard. None of which is probably measurable on telemetry and really makes any of those comparisons of who is braking latest a complete and utter waste of time. Well, not waste of time, but it's not correct data that's going in there to give you those conclusions. But that's kind of irrelevant to what we're talking about now. What we're talking about now is that there is no emphasis on ultra late braking. What he's trying to do is to extend the straight, and what he does is extend the straight perhaps at least 2 cars lengths in terms of full throttle, but maybe just dabbing the brakes a little bit just to get the weight down on the front. And then comes the hard braking when he's got the car settled.